Hey, what's up? Let's talk about albums. 1974 was a weird year because you had a lot of dominant soft rock and folk rock crossed over a lot into what a lot of people call a California soft rock or California rock. The Eagles and Fleetwood Mac. Fleetwood Mac's a weird situation because they kind of became California because of Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks joining, but old British blues rock band becomes California rock. But all of the Americas and Jackson Browne and all those people were coming up, but there was also 1974 was a big year for emerging disco to start happening, and so there was some big hits and stuff from that. But there was also a lot of hard rock converging on all of that too, and that's usually what would be what I would consider the album rock. So usually most of the Billboard stuff ends up being the lighter, middle of the road type stuff, and we'll do that when I do the countdown, but let's focus on the albums because that's usually where the really good stuff was, especially right here in the meat and potatoes of the 70s. Debut albums from 1974 would include the first Bad Company album, which is basically a greatest hits album right out of the gate. On Swan Song Records, Led Zeppelin's record label, they were the first band and the most successful band to come from Swan Song. Paul Rodgers and Jimmy Page collaborating 10 years later in The Firm, but we'll cover that in the 80s stuff. I think that was more like 85. Other debut albums, which I absolutely love, are Judas Priest's Rock-a-Rolla. By far from anything that they became when they became classic Judas Priest, but such a fun record for riffs and guitar stuff. It's super moody and super just raw and real. Rush's first album is released, and obviously Working Man is tour de force, but definitely a debut album. It was a pale comparison to what they would become in following years after Neil Peart ends up joining by the end of the year, and 1975 they're just off and running. Kansas's first album came out, and I'm not as familiar with it as I am with their bigger stuff, but I know it's the roots of prog, the 70s prog, pop prog, I guess you could say. There's some crazy music on that first Kansas album. They hadn't really had any big hits yet. That comes in the next couple of years, but can't go wrong with that first Kansas album. Bebop Deluxe was Bill Nelson was the guitar player for Roxy Music, I think. He first spun off from there. Honestly, I've never listened to it. I assume it's kind of like jazzy glam, proto or pre-punkish. My voice, it's on my list of stuff to get to. I just can't get to everything. Another one that I've never listened to is Todd Rundgren, his first Utopia album, and I haven't done an appropriate deep dive on Todd Rundgren. I love the idea of him, so it's on my list too. Another debut was Kiss, and that leads us into the next sort of semi-list, which is bands that had more than one album out in 1974. And Kiss debut came out, and by the end of the year they had Hotter Than Hell out, which as far as I can tell, is one of the least of those early, is one of the least known of those early Kiss records. Not a huge Kiss fan, so I can't really comment on some of that. Parasite's awesome, She Is awesome, Deuce, Strutter. I guess I like more of those songs than I give credit to it, but they're just definitely not very high on my list. So somebody that is a lot higher on my list would be Queen, and 1974 gave us Queen 2 and Sheer Heart Attack. Sheer Heart Attack is where they really first started getting hit singles and kind of building to where they would end up going. Queen 2 is significant because it's apparently the album that Nuno Bettencourt and Gary Cherone bonded over to form Extreme. So, a fun fact for you. Deep Purple changed up their lineup to what they call the Mark III lineup, with Glenn Hughes and David Coverdale replacing Roger Glover and Ian Gillan. And the song Burn is just fire straight out of the gate. It's named appropriately, definitely. Even though that guitar riff is amazing, and both singers get to showcase different parts of that song. It's basically a drum solo all the way through. If you're a drummer, go listen to that Deep Purple Burn, because it'll blow you away. So Burn and Stormbringer, both Mach 3 lineup albums, came out in 1974. And the second one is Stormbringer, and it's not as high energy, I don't think. But there's a super killer ballad. I forgot to write down the name of it on that album. Really starts to show you how bluesy and soulful of a singer David Coverdale was. Grand Funk had both of the albums that have Everything You Know by Grand Funk on them in 1974. It's just an embarrassment of riches in 1974. Like I said earlier, despite what the charts show you, a lot of mamby-pamby, middle-of-the-road stuff, but the rock stuff and the prog stuff was just on fire in 1974. King Crimson, the king of all prog rock to me, released their last two albums of the 70s with John Wetton on bass and vocals and Bill Bruford on drums, and obviously Robert Fripp on guitar. Starless and Bible Black was the first one, and I thought I liked Red better, and I do after listening back through some of the songs. Starless and Bible Black has some really amazing stuff on it. Usually not associated with prog, Frank Zappa put out his seminal Apostrophe album, which is Don't Eat the Yellow Snow, and the whole suite of songs that go with that. But he was still putting out Mothers of Invention albums, and the Mothers had just put out probably their biggest album, Overnight Sensation, with Dirty Love and Dynamo Hum and all that. Frank Zappa's solo stuff usually ended up being a compilation of what was left over. So there's a lot of Mothers stuff on there, like Don't Eat the Yellow Snow and all its accompanying sweet songs. But it also has a song called Apostrophe with Jack Bruce and Jim Gordon. It was just a jam they recorded. There's a song Zappa did with George Duke, and a couple other random things that were thrown in to measure it out to an album. After listening to it, I didn't realize that I knew more of that album than I thought I did. Another one that I've never really got a chance to deep dive on, Probably considered one of the at least top 5 greatest prog albums of all time. Genesis, Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. And I've put that in my playlist because that's one I definitely need in my brain. Gentle Giant, I don't really know a lot about them. I know they're one of the seminal prog rock bands. They were starting to get going right about then. Tangerine Dream did a lot of soundtracks like later on and through 70s and 80s. Probably they were pumping out albums from the 60s all the way through to the 80s or 90s. Supertramp's Crime of the Century. Knew it had the hit song Dreamer. Not much else on that album really resonated with me, but there's one song that I was surprised it had a video, so once I listened to it I was like, oh yeah, I remember that song. I totally spaced it off. A song called School. And thematically it's kind of another brick in the wall type of thing, and it really has kind of a Pink Floyd-y sound. I've listened to that song more than probably anything else that I've been researching for these videos. It just really grew on me again. Oh, such a good song. I'm going to talk about Yes first. They put out Relayer. It was one of the first of the really big shuffling of lineups that they did. And one of the people that was out was Rick Wakeman. And he put out his Journey to the Center of the Earth that year. Great prog concept album based on the H.G. Wells story. Steely Dan, Pretzel Logic, kind of sophisticated jazz rock more than prog. There's some other weird sonic experiments that they do on this album, but I just realized I'm not that big of a Steely Dan fan. They're just a little too smooth and perfect and sophisticated for me. There's no in there. There's no edge to me. Camel Mirage, that's probably Camel's most known album. They're a prog rock band that I've always seen the album covers. On one of their albums they used the camel from this Camel cigarette package. I remember seeing those albums, but I never had listened to any of it. And it's really good, deep prog rock. The way prog rock was like you think of as prog rock. We also, more prog rock adjacent, have ELO starting to pump out albums and hits in the 70s. I think the hit song was Can't Get You Out of My Head. That's what it is. Great song. Not near as good as some of the ones that are to come, but Emerson, Lake and Palmer, after putting out a couple of the albums that defined what prog rock was in the early 70s, they were left to a live album in 1974. Another prog adjacent, but more on the hard rock side, you had Blue Oyster Cult's Secret Treaties. I don't think their sound really aged very well. It's very, very 70s sounding to me. The only song I really stuck out to me on Secret Treaties was Astronomy. And I'm not sure if that's just because I was familiar with that song because of Metallica covering it, but Jethro Tull, another prog adjacent band, had War Child and Skating on the Thin Ice and Bungle in the Jungle were the two big songs off of that. super, super good. Jethro Tull was one of my dad's favorite bands, so I heard a lot of that stuff growing up. Aerosmith's Get Your Wings, their second album, starting to get their footing. I can't remember what the song that hits was. Back in the Saddle? No? Yeah, Back in the Saddle. Was that the hit off of that one? And also other cool songs like Lord of the Thighs, and probably their best ballad of all time, Season of Wither. Oh, I love that song. I guess now we're sliding into more of the glam side of 1974. You had Slade putting out albums. Sparks, which is a band I had always heard of. I've seen their albums a million times, and they kind of turned me off because it's the two brothers, and one's kind of the rock star guy, and the other one is kind of a little curmudgeon-y keyboard playing guy, but they always turned me off because their album covers, he always had that Hitler mustache. But I'm so glad I'm starting to go down a Sparks rabbit hole because they are one of the best bands ever. You listen to some Sparks and you'll mistake it for some Queen music that you never heard of. So good. And they're still putting out music to this day. So I've got a long road on a deep dive on those guys, but it's been really fun. Elton John's Caribou album. David Bowie's Diamond Dogs, which I've sort of started making myself listen to a little more, and it's grown on me a lot. It's the most crooner cabaret that David Bowie has been up to this point, which surprises me because the single was Rebel Rebel, so it kind of leads you to believe that the album is going to be a little more harder edge, and it's really not. It's really kind of almost David Bowie's version of show tunes in a way. Roxy Music, who I mentioned earlier, had a song called Love is the Drug. Not a huge fan of Roxy Music because I don't like Brian Ferry's voice, so I'm kind of excited about listening to some of the other stuff from the guys that split off, like the Bill Nelson's Bebop Deluxe, and the next one on the list, Brian Eno's Here Come the Warm Jets. If you've never seen the movie Velvet Goldmine with Christian Bale and Jonathan Rhys-Meyers and Eddie Izzard, and it's about this whole early prog area, prog time, sort of a David Bowie character, Iggy Pop character, and Mott the Hoople, which is David Bowie adjacent. New York Dolls, Too Much Too Soon. I love their sound. It's so fun and nasty and punk before punk was a thing. Also David Bowie adjacent and everybody else adjacent. Lou Reed's Rock and Roll Animal. Bob Dylan, Planet Waves. He sort of tried to flirt with the kind of glammy attitude, but never really stopped being Bob Dylan. Planet Waves is the one with Going, Going, Gone. It's probably top 5, one of my favorite Bob Dylan songs. Bob Dylan. The Who, Odds and Sods. Not really familiar with. I'm sure there's something on there that I know. Kind of started losing The Who in my mind after their big ones. After Who's Next and other big ones. The Rolling Stones, It's Only Rock and Roll. This is the last album with Mick Taylor on lead guitar, and It's Only Rock and Roll is probably top 5 of my favorite Rolling Stones songs. Apparently, fun fact that I didn't know about until just recently was that song, It's Only Rock and Roll, is David Bowie adjacent. He's actually playing acoustic guitar and helped write the song. So that makes it a whole lot more fun. All four Beatles members put out solo albums in 1974. Ringo, the least of which, except that he probably had the biggest hits that year. George Harrison's Dark Horse. Paul McCartney was still on Band on the Run. I keep forgetting to look that up. I think that actually came out in 1973, but it kind of crossed over into 74 because the big songs were on the charts, on the 74 charts. And John Lennon, surprisingly, didn't really chart very much off of Walls and Bridges, but a couple of his better songs, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, and Nobody Loves You When You're Down and Out, which is a weird story because I know there's a blues song called Nobody Knows You When You're Down and Out, and I always thought it was the same song, but now that I've put them on my list of songs to learn and listen to, they're two completely different songs. 1974 was knee-deep in John Lennon's Lost Weekend, is what he called when he separated from Yoko for a short period and was drinking and drugging with the Hollywood vampires in Los Angeles, which included Keith Moon and Alice Cooper and lots of other rock stars, including Harry Nilsson, who Lennon actually produced Harry Nilsson's Pussycats album. One more to mention that's sort of Beatles adjacent is Badfinger. I'm not sure what the hit was this year, but I think they had already had most of their big hits by this point. Maybe Baby Blue was the one that was big. But I think the first guy to unalive himself in that band happened that year, so it was kind of an abrupt, sad ending to Badfinger. On a more positive note, big comebacks were Eric Clapton with 461 Ocean Boulevard. Started having his big pop resurgence after kind of falling out and almost dying. Ted Nugent had the Great White Buffalo, Joe Walsh's So What album. Peter Frampton was starting to do his solo albums that didn't actually really sell very well, but he was padding up all the material that would be on his Frampton Comes Alive album a few years from there. You got Stevie Wonder putting out the tail end of all his greatest 70s records. Bachman Turner Overdrive's Not Fragile is the album that has every song you can think to associate with BTO. So that's probably their best album. Procol Harum was still putting out albums. The Eagles, On the Border. I think the hit is Already Gone. It's one of my favorite Eagles songs. Charlie Daniels, Fire on the Mountain. Not a big country guy. And but I think that's considered one of his better albums. The Grateful Dead, Mars Hotel, Big Stars, Radio City. They would have been the biggest band in the world in an alternative universe, but they just had misfortune thrown at them at every corner, at every point. There's a great documentary about them that you can find. I think it's free on YouTube, but it's probably on other streaming services too. I think I saw it on Netflix years ago. But it's such a sad story, and music's alright, I guess. Jefferson Starship, another one of my dad's favorite bands, so I knew a lot of this stuff growing up. And I would look at their album covers, and Dragonfly was always one that just kind of just sucked me in. What a great, great album cover. The big song was Ride the Tiger. They were just starting on their hard rock era, and that's my favorite era of Jefferson Starship. All the stuff they did through the 70s and early 80s up until you know what. Rapid fire, other bands that put out albums in 1974 that I never really listened to. Thin Lizzy, Status Quo, Budgie, Hawkwind, Foghat. I think their album actually had a hit, but I can't remember which one. Elf, Uriah Heep was still putting out albums. They changed lineups about every time they changed their underwear. Nazareth was still putting out records way into 70s and 80s. Susie Quattro, Leather Tuscadero from Happy Days. She predates Joan Jett by at least 6 or 7, 8 years. Predates the Runaways at least by 4 or 5 years. I was familiar with a lot of her music from a deep dive from a couple of years ago, and it's fun, punk, glam rock stuff. It's not great, but it's fun. But one of the things I learned in my research was she's associated with a guy named Mike Chapman, who has his fingers in tons and tons of 70s and 80s rock. He had this production company and I don't think he actually had a record label, but production company, and had his hands in a lot of stuff in the 70s and 80s. I'll probably do a deep dive on all the things associated with him because it's really interesting. Styx, we're on their second album. No hits yet. Focus, Montrose, Scorpions' Fly to the Rainbow was the first album with Uli Jan Roth, I think, on lead guitar. And man, I've been just falling in love with that Scorpion sound and the sound of his voice and the way they produce their guitars and stuff. Go away. So I did a deep dive on the Flight of the Rainbows album, and that stuff just sticks to my bones. And it's fun because they had the 74 album and the 84 album. Apparently they had stuff in all the way up into the 2000s. They just finished their Vegas residency for the 40th anniversary of Love at First Sting. But some of these early albums are really good too. Another one I never was exposed to when I was younger was UFO. I always knew who they were, and I know there was people that come and go. Obviously, Michael Schenker had just left the Scorpions to join UFO, so it was their huge album, Phenomenon. And as I listen to more of this stuff, it grows on me more and more. But they were kind of almost to me like the European version of Bad Company. Bad Company, though a lot of the members were from England, they had straight up American sound. That's why those first couple of Bad Company albums are just so classic. It's because they just sounds American to me. But UFO, it sounded dated when I first started listening to it. Singer Phil Moog's not quite as charismatic as Paul Rogers, and it just seemed like a second-rate Bad Company sort of to me, or even like Bad Company trying to do more prog guitar rock stuff. I don't know. It's growing on me the more I listen to it. Before I wrap up, I'll talk about some bands that hadn't quite put out albums yet, but were formed in 1974. You had 38 Special, who would be like the baby brother band of Lynyrd Skynyrd. Cheap Trick hadn't been signed yet. Bon Scott first joins AC/DC, and you'll see in 1984 when they get huge, kind of break through, whoever owned the tapes that they made when Bon Scott first joined in 1974 released those tapes as 74 Jailbreak. So it's 84 release, but it's actually 74 AC/DC, and really good. It's got them doing Baby Please Don't Go and some other blues songs. My dad had it on cassette, and we listened to it in the car a lot, so I'm kind of nostalgic to that early AC/DC sound. And the band Squeeze, who would together and separately do a lot of really influential stuff through the 70s and 80s. And last and definitely not least, we'll do the Ramones and Blondie, both who had just started playing a lot at CBGBs and were developing their individual sounds. Obviously, Blondie got a big boost because Debbie Harry was absolutely gorgeous, but they kind of went in more of a art rock sound by the late 70s. It almost was like disco. I would call Blondie the gateway drug from punk and disco, and blending them together into new wave. Anyway, that's the albums of 1974.